Hey guys, what is up? This is Mike Rosada, and this is the second video in the JavaScript Array superpowers, map, filter, and reduce videos. Last time we looked at map and filter, and this time we are looking at the array method reduce. This can be complicated for a lot of people to first wrap their heads around, but I'm very excited to teach you this. I actually made a bunch of images, and then we're going to do some code examples, and I'm super excited because in the next video, we're going to take all three of these superpowers, right? We're going to take map, we're going to take filter, we're going to take reduce, and we're going to work with a real API endpoint, and you're going to be able to do this yourself. I'm going to give you the endpoint, and you'll be able to play with it. It's thousands of lines of JSON data. It's mock data generated at JSON generator, and it simulates data for a dating site, and we're going to see how we can use these superpowers to do some really cool stuff, some stuff that people normally would pay you lots of money to do. But before we can get there, we have to master the basics. So let's take a look at what's on the screen. We have the reduce method being called on an array. I've inlined the array for illustration purposes, but normally you would not want to call it this way. So this would be some variable. The reduce method takes two arguments. The first argument is a function. So I think a lot of beginners might get confused when they look at this, and they might assume that accum and current are arguments to the reduce function. They are not. The whole entire first argument to reduce is this entire function. And it can be whatever function you pass in, but it's the entire function as the first parameter. So the second parameter is an initial value. It's an optional parameter. I urge you not to treat it as an optional parameter. You should always try to pass it in. And we'll go over why in a little bit. First, let's get the basics down. So reduce is going to go through each item in this array, sort of how map does, sort of how filter does. But in the end, it's only going to return one value. And in our case, it's going to be a number. So we're going to take this entire array, we're going to reduce it into one number. So the first iteration of reduce, it's going to take 0, and that's going to be our accumulator. I'll explain why. 10 is going to be our current. So those are the two arguments that get passed in here. Boom, the image changes. It all becomes super clear to you. You see that the initial value is passed in as accumulator, first item is current, and then our function runs against those two values. It does the addition operator, 0, 10 is 10. So that's what gets returned. Whatever gets returned from this function becomes the first parameter passed into the next call to our accumulator function, which is the function we passed in as the first parameter to reduce. So this is going to return 10, and 10 is going to become the value of accum, and 3 will become the value of our next current. Let's click the slide. Boom. Here we are. 3 is our current. Our accum is 10 because that was our last total. Add those up. You return it. That's 13. So we don't care about this initial value anymore. We're done with that. We don't care about 10 anymore. We haven't done anything to 10. We didn't mutate it. We didn't delete it. We're not doing anything to this array. Reduce creates an entire new, well, not a new array, an entire new return value. The old array remains untouched. So I cross these out, but not to be like, oh, they're gone forever. They're there. We just don't care about them currently. Let's flip to the next slide where 13 will be the accumulator and 14 will be the current. Boom. So as you can see, this accumulator is this function run against all the previous items in the array. And that's why I think reduce is a hard method for some people to get down, because the other methods that we dealt with, filter and map, no matter where an item was in the array, the function always did the same thing. It was very predictable. And this function itself is predictable, this accumulation function we wrote, because no matter if you pass 13 in as accum, 14 as current, you're always going to get 27. The difference is with our array items, if they were in a different order, even though in this case we'd get the same end sum, it would be different numbers returned from each function just because they're in a different order, right? If 14 was the first item in the array and 11 was the second, then we'd already be up to 25, not 27. Well, plus 14. Either way, let me not confuse you. Let me not confuse myself. So the next cycle of this function, it's going to pass 27 as the accumulator. 11 will be the current. So let's flip the slide. Boom. So here we are. 27 is the accumulator, 11 is the current. They go into the function. They get added. It's 38. It's returned. Reduce passes that value in as the accumulator to the next one. So the next one's going to be 38 and 5. So 5 is the last item of the array. Those get added up, and because there's no more items in the array, when reduce returns 43, it's just going to return that to us, to wherever we're assigning, this whole reduce method to. It's just going to return 43 because there's no more items to work on, so there's no reason to pass it to the next function. It just gets sent home. We're done. 43 is the end result of this. So you see that's kind of unique compared to the other ones. I'm going to flip through this real quick so you can just see. Here's what we start with. We got our function, our default value. Default value goes in. The first item goes in. And then we move through the array, running the same function against the next number and the accumulation of all the values. So it's a running total, right? It's pretty simple to understand, I think, once you see it in action. So now we're going to write some code. We're going to flip over here. You probably recall this. It's very similar to the data we had in the last video. I've added one more parameter, and that is the age parameter, because one of the things that we can do with reduce, it's very good at stuff like this, is getting totals, getting averages. So let's jump in and let's write some code. All right, so let's get the average age of all these users, and then let's get their average friends. So one way we could get the average age would be to first get total ages. And we do that basically using the same function that we saw in the slides. It's basically a sum function. It returns cum plus current, but since current is an object in this situation, we have to reach in and grab the age, where before we had numbers in the slides. So let's just make sure that this is correct before I show you some of the things that can go wrong. Actually, we're going to see it right here. So I didn't put the initial value in. So when we don't put an initial value in, let me just show you. With an initial value, we get our total age. When we don't put an initial value in, the JavaScript engine is going to pass us this object here as our accumulator to start. Because we don't pass an initial value, it just figures that this must be what we're expecting, this first object. And it starts with the second object as the current. I threw a breakpoint in so that we can see this in action as it actually goes down. And you can see this is the first breakpoint. Our accumulator is the first object of the users array. The current is the second. And we can't add 23 to an object. That's what gives us object 23. And then these are the rest of the numbers here, 40, 19, 23, 25. If I keep hitting play, I'm not going to play all the way through, but you can see there's our cum. It's all funky. Here's our next object. We grab the current age as 40. We add it to object 23. Then we have object 2340. The next it'll add 19. And on it goes until it returns us a long string of garbage that's useless. If we tried to get the average of that, we would end up with nan, not a number. So the other thing that could happen, if we only had one object in our array, well, then this function would never even get run. The reduce function runs, but like I said, this function here is just the first parameter to reduce, and if it doesn't have 2 arguments, it doesn't run. So the JavaScript engine just gives us back this object here. I'm going to play this so that you can see that in action. It's debugging, but the debugger's not stopping. It's returning back to us this first object. So that's kind of weird, and that could definitely mess with whatever you're trying to write. And there's one final situation that could cause you even more problems, and this is actually worse because it's going to throw an error. If you give an empty array plus no initial value, the JavaScript engine is going to throw an error back at you. So that's why I urge you to always have an initial value. It makes your life easier. It makes it explicit what you are asking to happen. So the next thing we could do, first let's get the average of this by dividing by users.length. Let's put our initial value in, like I said, or else we get nan. So there's the average age. Let's get average friends, and let's write this in a function off to the side. So this is going to have the same signature, and it's going to return the cum plus current dot friends length. And we can actually write out total friends users reduce. This is going to look a lot cleaner. Get friend count. Still remember the initial value, but that's a lot more declarative. You can read that almost like a sentence. Users, we're going to reduce, we're going to get the friend count. Copy that. Let's take total friends divided by users length, and we get back 2.54 repeating. So they have an average of 2.54 friends. That's a strange amount of friends to have. We could clean that up with math round. So the average user has 3 friends. So what if we wanted to get all this information without having to call reduce twice? Well, we could still do that. And the way we could do that is, what if we took the users and we still reduce, say get friends and ages. Well, our initial value will pass in an object. And the reason we'll pass in an object, let's copy this, change this to get friends and ages. Well, we could do more than one thing inside our reduce function. So this object becomes the accumulator for the first round, and we could say accum friends equals current dot friends length, and then we could say that accum age equals current age, and then we're just return the accum, and that should build up an object. Actually, let's do plus or equal. Let's give this the initial counts, friends, age. So now this builds up a running total of age and friends exactly like before. Let's log it. We could actually get a breakpoint in there. Let's run this, see what happens. So as it breaks, first accum starts totaling up our numbers. And the reason that first accum had values on it is because I put the breakpoint on return. We mutated that object already. So things are still going as planned. We're running through. You can see the accum keeps getting a higher number. I'm going to remove the breakpoint for time's sake. And then all we would have to do if we wanted the total friends is we could do accum friends divided by users dot length. Actually, you know what would be better? Let's say accum user count, and then let's add one more thing here. Let's say accum user count plus plus, add another value here, user count 0. So now this is going to total up the users as it goes through, and we can use that number instead of having to count on this array to get our averages. Run it, we get an error, and that's because accum doesn't exist out here, of course. Hope somebody else caught that before I did, because shouldn't be doing that. So let's call this stats. Then let's rename this to stats and run it. We get 2.54 repeating like we saw before for the friends. So that's one way we could pass an object in as an initial value, do multiple things in one run through. Well, it's multiple run throughs, but one reduce. Because if you're reducing over and over, every time you do another reduce function, you are calling every single item separately to that function. So if you had 10 items and we did all these separately, we'd be calling 30 functions. Instead, we're just calling 10, getting our totals, and then now we have them in one place. We can pass them around. So one other thing I said that we would get male to female ratio. We could do that like this. I won't delete this. We'll do users, reduce, accum, current. And just like before, instead of passing in an object, we can pass in a little set, an array of two numbers. And we'll call this first number, that'll be males, this will be females, or this could be females and this will be males. Male 0, female 1. And then as we reduce through the array, we can just check current user, get their gender. And we'll say if the gender is equal to male, then accum male plus plus, else accum female plus plus. That's a long way to write it out, but that's a easy way to be able to see it. That's very clearly an intent, even though this is written in line. So like here, we have a name to kind of say, all right, we're getting friends and ages. That's expressive. This, even though it's in line, is still very expressive. You could have written this shorter, but this is very easy to read, and that is very important when you're writing code, because if you can't read it, you can't fix it. That's a fact. Well, as close to a fact as you can get. So let's assign this to a value. We'll call this ratio. Log out the ratio. And then I hope you're getting what reduce does. I think that you should try some examples for yourself. But I'm going to show you one more trick. And if you don't get this last trick, if it doesn't make sense, that's fine. This is going to be like a tricky trick. It's composing functions together. This is why that's very important. We're going to compose functions together to make another function. Okay, I'm going to erase everything on the screen. You see that we got 5:6 ratio, male to female. You could further reduce that again to divide it, but we're just going to move on. I'm going to erase everything. So composing functions, you might not get this part, and that's fine, but I want to show you the power of the reduce function. So I'm going to write out what the compose function does. The compose function takes as many arguments as you want, and they're all functions. And then it returns a new function, and the new function takes the initial value of the reduction we're going to do. And what we do here is we reduce the functions, we return a reduction of the functions, and I won't even call this accumulator because I want this to be easy for you guys to understand. So the accumulator is the total value, and then the items are the functions, so we'll call them fn, and this returns fn total value. So I'm going to explain this to you. What you're looking at is a very powerful function, and I'm going to show you a basic example so that you can understand it. Let's pretend that we want to take one of these user objects, and then we want to get the name, and we want to say hello. So we have a function called get first user. It takes all the users and returns the first user. We have a function we'll call get user name. So it takes a single user, returns their name, username. And then we have a final function called say hello. It'll just take a name, return hello plus name. So you can notice a trend in these. This first function takes an array and gives back the single user object. This second function takes a single user object and returns a string, the name. And this third function takes a string, which is the name, and it returns hello name. So what compose does, and normally compose is a reduce write. Before we get into that, compose creates a new function. So we want to get first user. We don't want to call it. Then we want to get user name. And then we want to say hello. So that is our new function, and we can call this function say hello to first user. So it's console log say hello to first user, and we pass in users array, run it, says hello Michael. So why did that happen? Well, the compose utility took this function, and that function became the first function into our reduce, and users became the initial value. Let's see if we can get a good read through this with the debugger. So total value is an 11 array, all these users, that's the total value to start. And it runs that total value against the first function, which is get user function, and then total value becomes the first user object. You can see it over here on the right. So then the next call to reduce, we get a total value of this, and the function that's passed in is get username, because this collected all these into an array, and now we're just reducing that array here. So in the next round, total value is Michael, and the function is say hello, and then finally it returns say hello. Wonder if I put the return statement there, if we get some inline values. So I just want you to be able to see this. Now this is very powerful because this is what ends up happening. People will write functions that have general purposes, and they'll compose them together because you don't have to rewrite this compose ever again. You just pass functions to it, as many as you want, and then you make these utility functions built from your other utilities. The only difference is that In functional programming, compose is a reduce write. So in actuality, this is what this would look like. I didn't want to confuse you because it's hard enough trying to figure this out without trying to figure out how to read from right to left. But that's what happens. It reads from right to left. Get first user, get username, say hello. And you can compose entire programs like this using pure functions. I don't want to dive too deep into it. I just want to show you guys a treat of how powerful reduce can be. I hope you guys learned a lot in these past two videos. In the next video, as I said, we are going to be using an actual API, taking some large JSON data and doing a lot cooler stuff than what we did in this video. We're going to, like I said, we're going to try to boil down longitude and latitude into distance between users and get average distances. We're going to do a bunch of cool stuff, and then I'm going to let you use the endpoint on your own if you want, because it's hosted by JSON Generator, and you'll be able to play around with these functions and get some pretty good experience. All right? Have a great day. Hope you learned a lot. Hope you liked the video. Let me know if you want me to teach anything. Keep writing JavaScript.